Today I'm going to be talking about, as introduced, China's new action cinema, new type of action film, which to many of you may not actually seem terribly new because very similar to the type of action cinema that's been produced in the United States since at least the early 1980s or mid 1980s. But is relatively new to China in a certain style. Before I get into that, I'll mention the film series again. The films I'm talking about today are not too related to the current series, although there is a little connection I will discuss. But you can pick up a booklet, I think, from the back and find out about the films that are showing, all of which I highly recommend. To begin, as I've mentioned, the topic of today's lecture is not that closely related to the film series, but there is a connection that I do want to mention by way of introduction. In the film series, there's a wonderful Chinese independent film called The Summer Is Gone. And in this film, which is a semi-autobiographical drama by a first-time writer-director called Dante Lam, an unemployed father tries to take his son to the cinema in 1994 when the film is set. And he's trying to take his son to see The Fugitive, which some of you may remember, the Harrison Ford action movie from 1993. So he tries to take his son to see The Fugitive, which at that point in time was the first big American film to actually be shown in Chinese cinemas on a revenue-sharing basis, whereby profits would be split between China and the United States, which was a condition that previously could not be reached. But when they actually arrive at the cinema, father and son find that not only is there a new management in place to accommodate this scheme, but they're not able to sneak in. They're used to sneaking in for free and not having to pay at the neighborhood cinema, so they don't actually end up getting to see The Fugitive. There is, however, a really long line of people waiting to see the movie who are quite happy to pay and don't feel they need to sneak in. And this is a scene in this film that says a lot about China's movie-going culture at that point in time and how it was about to change, how it was going to become more of a luxury, and it would be a sign of a class system or a class division if somebody could afford a cinema ticket or not. But it also points to how China's movie system would find itself in competition with these American blockbusters, as more could come in on a revenue-sharing basis. So since then, China's own film industry has developed at a rapid, rather formidable pace, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And it's made lots of blockbusters of its own, or at least films that are classed as blockbusters based on a domestic performance. And most recently, this has been fantasy films like Monster Hunt and The Mermaid. However, this summer, just a few months ago, that all changed. So after several decades where action films like The Fugitive were a fixture and a mainstay, China finally made its own Hollywood-style action film in this movie, Wolf Warrior 2. This film's been a runaway success in China, where it grossed $870 million in that one territory alone. It's now the most successful film of all time at the Mainland China box office, and it's the third highest earning film in a single territory. The only two films ahead of it in single territory are Star Wars: The Force Awakens and Avatar, based on their performances here in the United States. This popularity of Wolf Warrior 2 demonstrates the growth of China's multiplex market in the past 10 years or so, and it also shows the pent-up demand that the audience has had for a long time for a homegrown action cinema, a Chinese version of Hollywood that puts a Chinese hero at the center of a production that matches Hollywood film in terms of technical quality and narrative drive. In an August 16th New York Times article on the film's popularity, the journalist got a quote from a gentleman called Zhao Ping, a Beijing parcel delivery worker in his 20s who was just coming out of a showing of Wolf Warrior 2. And this gentleman said, we must admit that for a long time your Hollywood movies have been better made than Chinese movies, so we watched them all. But now you must also admit that this movie was pretty good, and it has a Chinese hero. In the months that have followed this film's record-breaking run, Wolf Warrior 2 has been portrayed as an outlier of sorts in China's multiplex landscape for delivering an action film that in very broad strokes looks at China's emerging position as a geopolitical force. However, it's actually just the latest in a recent run of mainland China action films that have made a conscious break from the tales of heroism that are usually set in the ancient past to try to focus on a more contemporary hero in a contemporary setting. Other entries in this cycle, which I'll discuss today, are Operation Mekong from 2016, An Extraordinary Mission, which was released earlier this year. And these are films that are now aiming to compete directly with the Hollywood imports rather than to be a different type of attraction catering just purely to local culture taste. In 2017, China's film industry endeavors to maintain a 50-50 local market share with Hollywood. And this is a ratio that's achieved through various degrees of creativity, ranging from blackout periods when only local films are shown and no Hollywood films are allowed into the market for a 1 to 2 month period, to actually making a number of films that the local audience genuinely wants to see. And usually what they end up with is a yearly box office top 10 like this one from 2016, where five of the top performing titles are Chinese movies, and the other 5 are the Hollywood imports. Hollywood, despite China's efforts, remains a big competitor for audience share. And this is primarily because of its mastery of action adventure movies or contemporary action films, which is a genre that China until now hasn't really tackled. And before cinema really even entered this global era we're now in, where big commercial movies seem to open all over the world at the same time, day and date, Hollywood had already realized that action is one of, if not the most exportable film genres. Action movies grab the audience's attention, they have non-stop energy, they're full of chase scenes, they have nick-of-time rescues, and sometimes jaw-dropping displays of physical agility. Also of importance here is the fact that action films always have a resourceful hero or heroine, someone who struggles against seemingly insurmountable odds to defeat a villain who has few, if any, redeeming qualities. The hero or heroine in this film will usually attain victory by the film's end after some strenuous physical feats and acts of violence which, in the context of the screen world, are reasonable and acceptable. Action films have traditionally been aimed at a male audience, aged about 20 to mid-30s, but in today's world that has changed greatly. And now action movies cross genders, cross age groups, cross generations and nationalities. Despite their technical sophistication, action films remain relatively straightforward in terms of universal appeal. Megan Morris, writing in Hong Kong Connections, Transnational Imagination in Action Cinema, summarizes that action cinemas generally mobilize or reanimate aspects of an old form of storytelling, whether myth, epic, legend, folk tale, saga, annals, or chronicle, whereby a hero or band of heroes faces an unknown land or confronts intruders at home. In order to tell this type of story, Hollywood, of course, has established various formulas, and other national cinemas have imitated or adopted them and tweaked them to suit their own national characteristics, whether you're talking about action movies from Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam. They've all tried to put their own spin on it, and most have done so quite successfully. However, the Hollywood import, regardless of territory, exerts a very strong grip on the consumer imagination. If contemporary Hollywood action films are considered to start in the 1980s, then China was, of course, very slow to experience this kind of high concept, all action storytelling. And this was mainly as a result of the country's closed currency policy in that period, which negated the prospect of the American studios from being able to enter the market and have a market share. However, a small number of American films were eventually brought into China in the 1980s. They were brought in by the China Film Corporation, which is a state-run company. One of the first American action films to be shown in China is one some of you may remember either fondly or not so fondly, depending on your politics. First Blood, which is the first film in the Rambo series with Sylvester Stallone. And this was brought into China in the late 1980s, almost 8 years after it had actually first been shown in the United States. But even though it was coming into China very late, for those people who were able to see it, presumably in the urban centers, they were able to get this sense of excitement from an action movie. And along with other genres, Hollywood's action films could then be accessed through video cassette when the piracy market started in the late 80s, early 90s. And video cassette recorders became more available to middle-class families. And then going into the 1990s and the advent of the video CD, the forerunner of the DVD, more of these films became easily obtainable. So when The Fugitive actually arrived in China, it did so at a critical time for China's entertainment economy. Cinema attendance in Shanghai in 1992 had dropped by 41.7% from that in 1991. Attendance in Beijing in April 93 declined 78% from the same period in 1992. At this point, Hollywood films were actually needed. They were needed to boost flagging ticket sales, and they were also needed to drive creativity, to give Chinese filmmakers and studios a sense of competition, a way of saying, look, you really must do better. The Summer Is Gone, the film that's showing in the series, takes some liberties with the facts. It has the fugitive playing in the young protagonist's summer holiday. The reality was The Fugitive actually opened much later in the year. It came out around November, December of '94. But nonetheless, the neighborhood enthusiasm you'll see in the film, if you go to see it, is most likely accurate. The Fugitive grossed a then impressive $3 million in China, despite the fact that the country then still had very limited exhibition means for feature films. And sensing that audiences would soon develop a preference for this kind of fast-paced Hollywood action film, the Guangzhou-based newspaper Southern Weekly declared, starting with The Fugitive, Chinese cinema itself has become the fugitive. So staggered releases of Hollywood action blockbusters started after this point. True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger was shown in China in '95, and that had then record attendance. And in the meantime, China's growing film audiences were gaining further access to blockbusters through the pirate DVDs, which by this point were in wide circulation. And then, of course, later, the internet, where movies are downloadable legally or otherwise. More officially, market liberalization was introduced, and this meant that 34 Hollywood or international films could come into China every year as part of an agreed import quota. So China's moviegoers are now able to get their sort of cinematic adrenaline kick, if you will, from all the main international franchises. So Mission Impossible comes in, The Expendables, and Jason Bourne, Fast and Furious. And then some other sort of, you could say, lower profile or slightly lower budget American series like London Has Fallen and Mechanic Resurrection. And these films are all extremely popular in the mainland China market. As the Beijing producer Isabelle Glachant explained in an interview with Variety, to the Chinese audience, going to see a Hollywood actioner is like going to Disneyland. They are enjoying what the rest of the world has been seeing again and again. Sometimes they like a lot of films that the rest of the world doesn't like very much. Indeed, China's growing love of action cinema does not just encompass films that have already proved popular in the United States, but often films that completely floundered here in their home country. A good example of this is actually a 2013 film called Escape Plan, which paired Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, but unfortunately when they were a bit past their prime. And this film grossed $41 million in mainland China, which is roughly a third of its global take, and it's almost double what it made here in the United States. As the industry analyst Robert Kane explains, these films outperform in China for the same reasons they outperform in other non-English speaking territories. They are long on spectacle and mostly short on dialogue and character emphasis. They provide a level of effects and production value that can't be matched by homegrown films, and they target the prime movie-going demographic of 12 to 25-year-olds. These Hollywood action films often have a particular appeal to a Chinese generation born in the 1980s and 1990s. A generation that has come of age amid a clash between a traditional collectivist culture and the emergence of individualism. And in this climate, Hollywood characters, particularly those who are defined more by their actions than their words, become a way for a younger Chinese audience to really interrogate their own cultural ideas and cultural identities about what it is to be an individual. And they are not really able to do this by watching the more local state-affiliated product or news or media. For other viewers in China, however, the relationship with Hollywood action films is based more just on a general craving for escapism, rather than a need for an ideological testing ground. It's not always terribly political. User comments regarding Hollywood action films on the website Douban, which is basically the Chinese version of IMDb, Internet Movie Database, suggest that spectacular stunts, fast pace, magnificent special effects are the main reason for seeking out these films. Some users will profess some skepticism about the emphasis on individualism or the American hero, while still conceding that they've enjoyed the film's aesthetic qualities. This is a rather limited level of engagement with a movie, even with an action movie. And it's one that I've noticed sometimes going to see films in China. I think the first time I observed it was in 2011 when I went to see Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol in a cinema in northern China. And as the film was actually entering its final scene, which is a dramatic wrap-up for the main character of Ethan Hunt, played by Tom Cruise, I was aware that a lot of the Chinese audience were actually just getting up to leave. They weren't interested in the final scene that was going to resolve the character arc. They realized that they'd seen all the spectacle, they'd seen the stunt reel, and you know what the heck, they really didn't need to see Tom resolve his issues, and they were quite happy to just get up and leave. Yeah, maybe not a bad idea, but anyway. Such an indifferent response to the personal life of the main character in the movie has much to do with Chinese notions of heroism. In contrast to Western notions of heroism, Chinese heroism generally places, or really I should say always places, an emphasis on collective interests with particular consideration given to national concerns. The heroes in Hollywood action films often represent vigilantism, a type of retaliation that presupposes that justice exists independently of the state. And such characters ask the audience to accept that individuals are the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. The box office rewards for such characters stems partly from our celebration of individual rights and a culture that holds in high esteem those who would stand up in the face of injustice, often including injustice which is being committed by a central government. Western heroes, as part of their screen journey, are often allocated a personal flaw as well as physical obstacles. So the protagonists are very much work in progress who are defining themselves throughout the narrative. Some may even have negative qualities and be classed as anti-heroes. By contrast, the heroes seen in Chinese films, particularly the wuxia martial hero films, exhibit near-perfect personalities. The image of the Chinese hero is powerful yet peaceful, comparatively lacking in tension or strife, and serving as a role model or a figure of inspiration. These Chinese heroes often turn out to be tragic figures if we look at them from a Western standpoint, in that in order to achieve their goal, they must often sacrifice themselves. Thus, the ending sometimes will find the hero actually dying for the betterment of the nation. The most famous example of this trope, perhaps, is Zhang Yimou's film Hero, where Nameless, played by Jet Li, sacrifices his life in order that his target, the king, can actually live and unite the warring states. And this, of course, contrasts with American movie heroes who, after accomplishing their tasks, usually go home to the family to unify the family unit, or enjoy a period of rest before their next mission in the inevitable sequel. So China's film industry now offers its audience a whole plethora of genres. In terms of films that are actually set in today's China, contemporary set films though, action doesn't really register as a contemporary set genre. Displays of spectacular heroism are limited to films set in ancient times or recreations of wartime conflict. Films set in the present are usually upscale romantic comedies, lifestyle fantasies, as I like to call them. They might be knockabout farces in the style of Lost in Thailand, or socially conscious dramas. Until recently, this lack of locally produced contemporary action films has allowed Hollywood to completely dominate that segment of the market. However, China's producers are now competing with their own action movies. Wolf Warrior, Operation Mekong, Extraordinary Mission, and Wolf Warrior 2 constitute a run of local action titles that have tried to combine the firepower that a studio can now afford with degrees of patriotic feeling. In this respect, giving the domestic audience something that's familiar through years of exposure to Hollywood action films, but actually has more Chinese characteristics and speaks to them more on a personal level. Unlike the martial hero blockbusters of the 2000s, none of these new Hollywood action films have really enjoyed a significant international release. Overseas theatrical runs have been limited to US engagements on maybe 50 to 100 screens in cities that have a significant Chinese population. Wolf Warrior 2's US gross of $2.7 million is actually quite strong for a limited foreign language release at this time, but it pales in comparison to the 2000s when Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Hero were big crossover hits. However, these new action films are not really aiming for global domination. They exist in an industrial mid-range. The budget spectrum ranges from just $5 million for Wolf Warrior in 2015 to $30 million for Wolf Warrior 2 in 2017, which seems like a big jump, but if you consider that $150 million was spent on Zhang Yimou's film, The Great Wall, it's a bit of a bargain. So in the case of a lot of these films, the directorial talent is actually not mainland China filmmakers. It's often sourced from Hong Kong. Dante Lam is known for tough thrillers like Beast Stalker and The Stool Pigeon. Extraordinary mission director, or co-director I should say, Andrew Allen Mack, is known for the Infernal Affairs series and the Overheard films, the latter of which became a mainland co-production with its third entry in 2014. These are directors who've been operating at the top level of the Hong Kong industry, but the budgets now available from mainland productions ensure that they can work on a bigger canvas. And meanwhile, Beijing-born Wolf Warriors director star Wu Jing has also worked extensively in Hong Kong, where he made his directorial debut with Legendary Assassin in 2008. With regards to casting, China's cinema is now catering to various ages. So even within a genre where you might think casting would have a very particular type, these films cast actors who have quite different fan bases. Operation Mekong pairs two actors with very different generational appeal. Zhang Hanyu rose to prominence in Feng Xiaogang's films. He now often plays characters who have a really grizzled authority in sort of military action films. And then you also have Eddie Peng, who is a Taiwanese-Canadian actor, singer, and model. He's a very busy man. And he enjoyed his biggest successes really with sentimental romantic comedies. And he's been rebranding himself a little bit as an action star in these Dante Lam films. Extraordinary mission star Wang Swan is less well known to the local multiplex audience, even in China. Most of his roles were in independent films, with 2 appearances for the controversial 6th generation director Lo Ye. Wolf Warrior and Wolf Warrior 2 star Wu Jing is another case entirely. As I mentioned before, he's actually spent much of his career in Hong Kong, where he's played mainly supporting roles. And has only been seen sporadically in mainland films, although he's a Beijinger. His home industry, until recently, regarded him really more as a stuntman than a viable lead, and he wasn't taken very seriously in mainland China, and has been regarded as a bit of an overnight sensation, although he's been in the industry for the best part of 15 years. The characters they play in these films are interesting. They're all public servants or members of the armed forces. In Operation Mekong, the main protagonists are members of a special police task force. In Extraordinary Mission, the main character is an undercover police officer. And in the Wolf Warrior films, the main character is a member of the People's Liberation Army, but not just a regular soldier. He's part of a special unit. But these characters are all actually given more individual motivation for their efforts that points to a deeper motivation than you would usually get in a mainland China movie of this type. These motivations sound a bit like they come from stock. They're almost cliches, really, in terms of an American action film, but they're newer to mainland China. In China, the term small love is often used to refer to people's affection for one another, for friends and family. And the term great love is used to mean one's passionate love for the country, for the nation that puts this emphasis on collectivism. Great love always comes ahead of small love when it comes to ranking emotions, but these films contrive to place 2 emotions side by side. In Operation Mekong, one character is driven to take down a drug kingpin because of an addiction to the villain's product caused the death of his girlfriend. Extraordinary Mission is similar. The main character wants to take down a drug dealer because his mother suffered from addiction. In the first Wolf Warrior film, the main character of Lung Feng is something of a blunt instrument, something I'll come to later. But by the sequel, he's trying to track down whoever's responsible for the murder of his girlfriend and has a much more individual motivation. Yu Yu San, the manager of one of the companies involved in Wolf Warrior 2, claims that the film has struck a chord with audiences because it portrayed individual heroism in the style of a supercharged Hollywood film. He stated, "Now China has entered a period when individualism is more appreciated and the audience is getting more mature." As part of their individualism, the characters in these films also exhibit a rugged can-do masculinity, which is actually becoming quite rare in China's commercial cinema. which has been pushing very cosmopolitan male images in recent decades with a whole run of comedies and dramas set in urban centers and dealing with very nicely dressed young professionals. In his influential text theorizing Chinese masculinity, society, and gender in China, Cam Louis says, while there is a macho tradition in China, it is not the predominant one. In the Chinese case, the cerebral male model tends to dominate that of the macho, brawny male. In addition, China's media has also been inundated in recent years with what is known as xiao xian rao, or little fresh meat, a rather nasty term, frankly, coined to describe the sculpted androgynous young actors who have featured in films and television series. Here's just one example. And these actors are cast in these roles regardless of whether or not their pristine appearance even suits the role, as was the case here with Li Yufeng as an undercover communist agent in Sparrow, looking like he's just come from an appointment at the salon. And this trend recently reached a point of public derision with the release of a state-backed main melody film called The Founding of an Army. And this was released on the same day as Wolf Warrior 2. And the film cast like every available young actor as a wartime historical figure. And it got a lot of derision online because a large section of the audience is just really tired of this trend by this point. Ye Daiying, who is actually the grandson of a military commander who was depicted in this film by one of these actors, took to social media to deride the cast as effeminate actors who can barely stand up straight. So he was infuriated by all of this casting. China's new action films, even when casting a relatively young performer, favor a tougher masculine image that tries to fuse the taut, lithe compactness of the Asian body with elements of the Hollywood action film that can really pay tribute to the hero's physical resolve. This is seen in Extraordinary Mission here, when the main character is subjected to torture to determine whether or not he's an undercover police officer. As Jeffrey Brown has asserted, the torture of male action heroes allows the camera to appreciate the shirtless and bound bodies of male ideals as they valiantly writhe in pain without any feminizing or homoerotic implications. The tortured male body is not a passive and inviting spectacle. It is a body that demonstrates strength and resilience, even when it is at its most vulnerable point. These films find these very masculine heroes either protecting or crossing borders as a means of facilitating a setting for big spectacle. Whereas American cities face the threat of destruction and frequently do explode as the hero responds to national panic, China's new action film is unable to show localized destruction or terror because of censorship restrictions regarding how its monuments and its cities are portrayed on screen. So as a result of this, films like Operation Mekong and Extraordinary Mission don't take place in mainland China. They both take place in the Golden Triangle, the notorious intersection between Laos, China, Thailand, and Myanmar, known for drug trafficking. Wolf Warrior does take place in China, near the southwestern border, but its more expansive sequel, which I'll come to later, is set in an unnamed African country. To look at some of these films in a bit more detail, Operation Mekong can be seen as China's first major foray into the field dominated by Hollywood, which is the interventionist action epic. This film has Gao Gang, an anti-narcotics officer in China's Ministry of Public Security, an intelligence officer, Fang Xin-wu, leading a task force to storm the Golden Triangle in pursuit of justice. They're investigating the slaying of 13 Chinese cargo ship crew members by mercenaries, with the mercenaries being in the employ of a Burmese drug lord. The film is actually based on a true story. And in reality, China's Ministry of Public Security worked with the Thai and Burmese authorities to bring the drug lord to justice But Operation Mekong is an action movie, so it simplifies things. At the beginning, the film does pay some lip service to international cooperation, with brief scenes showing meetings between China and some Southeast Asian diplomats. And after that, it's a completely Chinese operation. The other countries fall out of the picture, and it's the Chinese agents who go into the Golden Triangle to take down the bad guy. And this means they sometimes have to flee from local authorities because their activities are supposed to be under the radar. Although this film is a procedural in the sense that it systematically tracks an operation, it's far from rigorously detailed. It's certainly not a Michael Mann movie. It has just enough exposition to connect the dots for the action scenes. And in this respect, Operation Mekong follows more of a video game structure, where the cast go through a number of mini missions, which get increasingly harder and more destructive as it builds up to the big climax. All of this is covered by dynamic camera angles to make each sequence more exciting. Dante Lam attaches his camera to the side of a car, the tail of a helicopter, or under the carriage of a boat, whatever it takes to make it more exciting. And much of the film is excessive and over the top. It has a destructive 16-minute midpoint set piece where an entire mall is pretty much destroyed. There's also lots of scenes and touches that are directly culled from Hollywood action films, as if to simply say, we can do this too. Such as the base of Fang Xing Wu with a picture-filled bulletin board of the cartel members he wants to apprehend to get to the main villain, and a meeting that takes place in a structure under construction, a choice of venue that does not seem particularly practical or realistic, but is simply there to instill a sense of scale. So Lam can use a swooping helicopter shot in the manner of Michael Bay or Tony Scott and just have something that looks great on screen. The high-octane finale involves a speedboat chase, the culmination of which conflates the needs I mentioned earlier, the national needs of great love and individualist small love. As Gao Gang is extracting the villain by helicopter, he finds himself under fire from one of the drug lord's remaining henchmen who is navigating a speedboat. And to take out the threat, Fang Xing Wu sends his speedboat flying into that of the henchman, which causes an explosion in which they both perish. The strength of the nation, the great love, the traditional arc of the Chinese hero is maintained by the selfless act as the drug lord is sent back to China to be tried. But it also takes care of the individual quest. The character here avenges the death of his girlfriend by sacrificing his life. So it takes care of these two audience requirements and two levels of involvement. In this respect, or in this film rather, a true story is used as a springboard for a series of thrilling set pieces. Despite the success of the real operation being documented by China's media and giving the film a solid promotional hook, its advertising didn't really play up this aspect, possibly based on a concern regarding how far the film had actually deviated from the facts. And the film actually saves its based on a true story tag for the end credits. It doesn't mention it up front, by which time the audience has had its action fix and probably doesn't care whether the movie was based on a true story or not. The end credits actually feature photographs from the real operation. This shows an extensive tactical operation being conducted from state facilities. And in a way, it effectively concedes that what the audience has just seen is an action-packed spectacle. This ragtag crew of heroes who act more on instinct than necessarily reliable information is the stuff of pulp action cinema, and not really to be taken too seriously. And this film was very quickly followed by Extraordinary Mission. This one is completely a work of fiction and also takes place in the Golden Triangle. And this finds the directors using the Golden Triangle as a space for individualistic hero building. The main character, Liu Haijun, has infiltrated a narcotics network under an alias, having worked alongside drug traffickers for a number of years in the fictional South China industrial city of Yunlai. And the undercover operative has got plenty of evidence, but has been unable to connect it to his main target, Eagle, who is a cartel figurehead. and he runs his empire from the Golden Triangle. The main character gets his chance when he's escorted to Eagle after a drug bust results in his identity being questioned. He convinces the cartel head of his loyalty and gains deeper access to the operation, although Eagle is still suspicious of the undercover agent and tries to turn him into a morphine addict in order to keep control of him. To give you a better idea of these types of films, I'll show you the trailer for this movie. Usually I show clips, but action movies, I think it's better to show the trailer because all the best bits are in the trailer. So if I show you this, it really is just like watching the movie in 90 seconds. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about by the time we're done. Okay, here's the Extraordinary Mission trailer.
组织上计划派人渗透了一个贩卖高纯度海洛因的贩毒集团。你将一个毒贩渗透过程，无从组织安排。怎么做成？全部带到回去。我的钱都我干嘛？ You get the idea. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Oh, go back. Ooh, fast. Okay. Skip in. All right. So this is very much a film of two halves. The first half is set in mainland China, and it's very steely and grim. And then the second half takes place in the Golden Triangle. And this is where the hero gets cut off from his superiors, and he ends up acting in a much more individualistic manner. He gets romantically involved with the bad guy's sister, and he also has to sort of kick this morphine addiction, which he manages to do. The film saves its real spectacle for the last 20 minutes, and it's a lot of fun. A dusty city becomes the stage for a showdown, and this showdown just throws in everything. It's got rooftop running, gun battles in the streets, you'd think it was a war zone, car crashes, and there's this implausible but undeniably thrilling motorcycle stunt, which frames the hero in a hero pose, using slow motion or speed ramping to capture him in this moment. The film's quite careful to avoid the one-man army trope, which wouldn't be very appealing in China. The hero in the end is supported by a combat team, and this makes the eventual defeat of the bad guy a triumph of individualism, but one that's been achieved through collective action. As much as the film promotes the individual hero, it does not do so at the expense of the official channels, and the film lacks some of the tension that you might associate with this type of drama, particularly compared to a lot of Hollywood undercover cop films or those made in Hong Kong. Alan Mak, the co-director of this film, is a leading practitioner of this type of movie. He co-directed Infernal Affairs, a movie that really relaunched Hong Kong genre cinema in 2004 following the post-handover period. But as with, unlike Infernal Affairs, where the main character, an undercover police officer, was rather tortured, the character here doesn't really have that inattention. He remains steadfast in his resolve and maintains a strong relationship with his handler. It's never really suggested that the police force doesn't have his back. But the path towards realizing a really individualistic action hero is best represented really by the Wolf Warrior films. In the first movie, the main character Leng Feng is a marksman in the People's Liberation Army, and he gets reprimanded for failing to obey a direct order during an operation. But he still ends up getting recruited for War Wolf, which is this special elite unit.
And this is a movie that literally wears its politics on its sleeve. There's a moment where the heroes are getting ready to go to battle, and they actually sew patches onto their arms that have "Fight for China" written on them before they face the enemy. And there's a line in this movie, those who challenge China's resolve will have no place to hide. And that's repeated 2 or 3 times during the film. In this installment, the main character shows flashes of personality, unfortunately only when he's intoxicated and flirting with a female superior in a rather chauvinistic manner. Otherwise, he's pretty blank. He's a bit of a robot, and he just pledges allegiance to his team and to the army. We see him undertake various training exercises, and he eventually takes on a team of foreign mercenaries. At the end of the film, when he's facing off against the main bad guy, an American terrorist, he actually asks the villain, he taunts him, he asks him, "Do you speak Chinese?" The bad guy goes, "What?" At which point Lang Feng curses him, comes out with some very nasty Chinese curse words, and kills the baddie. It's pretty brutish and not terribly pleasant, but it becomes interesting when you compare the film to its sequel, China's most successful film of all time. The first Wolf Warrior, as weak a movie as it is, was a surprise box office success in mainland China, where it grossed $89 million, but its brand of jingoism came in for some criticism, and a lot of its ticket sales actually came from 2nd or 3rd tier cities. It was very popular in the South, and it was playing to pretty much empty cinemas in the urban centers, indicating regional differences in terms of response to nationalistic sentiment. And that happens here with American action movies. Perhaps bearing this in mind when developing the sequel and trying to harmonize the divide, Wu Zheng significantly modifies his main character of Lan Feng to make him a more individualistic hero, one that will still represent national power, but be more palatable to a wider audience. Unlike the first film, where the character is very much part of a unit, by this second movie he's become a lone wolf. Through a series of flashbacks, we learn that he's been kicked out of the military following his action at the site of a forced demolition, where he actually assaults and kills a scheming property developer who was trying to evict the family of a fallen comrade. And in this moment, Lang Feng's love for the friend and his teammate takes precedence, although he accepts the fact that he's crossed the line and he ends up serving a 2-year prison sentence. Throughout the film, though, he will often say, "Once a wolf warrior, always a wolf warrior." But the main storyline will see him acting as an independent man of action who makes choices based on relationships to other individuals or groups, rather than acting on the orders of a higher command. Lang Feng relocates to Africa following his release from prison, and he's seeking revenge for the murder of his girlfriend, who is also in the People's Liberation Army and has been killed supposedly while in Africa on a mission. The only clue of what has befallen her is a bullet that is found at the scene of her capture, and Lan Feng wears this bullet around his neck throughout the whole movie, so you're constantly reminded of his more personal motivations here. Stripped of his army clothing, mostly clad in jeans and a t-shirt, Lan Feng here has become something of a world citizen, comfortable in another culture, now happily speaking English with some fluency. In the sequel, he acts on more of a protective instinct rather than orders. He single-handedly protects Tundu, a young African boy with whom he's developed a fatherly bond, as well as a Chinese supermarket owner when they get caught in the midst of a fierce street battle. To rescue, when the Chinese peacekeeping force arrives to rescue survivors from this attack, he originally plans to return to Beijing, but ends up volunteering for a mission to retrieve an eminent Chinese doctor and 47 other Chinese citizens. And his motivation for doing this doesn't really come from the military. It comes from the African character here, Tundu, whose mother is trapped in a Chinese-invested factory alongside other workers. And Lan Feng plans to save the doctor and then save the child's mother. As with the Golden Triangle setting, this sequel, which is set in Africa, affords Wu a creative license to up the ante in terms of the hero's exploits, which become almost superhuman at times. The opening sequence is a balletic one-take display that has him single-handedly foiling pirates who attempt to rob a cargo ship. He leaps into the ocean, overturns their speedboat, knocks them all out while underwater. It's fabulous. Soon afterwards, he will also single-handedly protect Tundu and the Chinese supermarket owner by somehow using a mattress coil to stop a rocket-propelled grenade and divert it somewhere else. I've seen the movie and can't even believe I'm reading this. There are further displays of individual strength, but Lang Feng does receive assistance from other people. He receives assistance from a Chinese-American doctor, Rachel Smith, played by Selena Jade. She saves his life at one point by curing a fatally infected wound with an experimental treatment. And the head of security at the factory, He Jingguo, played by Wu Gang, who happens to be another former PLA soldier, which is very convenient. The climax finds Wu acquiescing to national power. He ends up pinned down and outnumbered by marauding rebels and mercenaries. Instead of taking all of these rebels and mercenaries on, as perhaps Rambo would do, Lang Feng records the activities on his smartphone, transmits it to the Chinese military, and they're able to fire off a counterattack from the coast of Africa. Lang Feng eventually leads the rescued workers to a United Nations camp, and it's guarded by Chinese peacekeepers. When the truck is blocked by rebels fighting government forces, the passing seems impossible. But this is until Lang Feng wraps a Chinese national flag on his arm and waves it. At this point, all the African warlords stop shooting, and they let the convoy pass. The final shot of the film, which has come in for a lot of discussion in China, is a shot of the Chinese passport, and the text that comes up on the screen alongside it reads, "Citizen of the People's Republic of China, whenever you are in danger overseas, don't give up. Please remember, behind you stands the powerful motherland." Talking to the New York Times, Yin Hong, a film critic who also teaches at Tsinghua University in Beijing, insisted, "This film satisfies the audience's admiration for an individual superhero, but behind that there's also a strong sense of country." Now, the relationship between China's recent run of action films, real-life events, and national mood has led some to classify these films as main melody, which places them in a category of government-sanctioned productions that are propagandist in nature, usually seeking to reaffirm the official narrative of modern Chinese history. Wolf Warrior 2 may be set in Africa, but it's reminded audiences of the 2011 military evacuation of 35,000 Chinese nationals from Libya, which at that time was the largest non-combatant operation by the PLA. This was repeated in Yemen in 2015 when a Chinese warship was deployed to evacuate 225 foreign citizens. In a 2017 article for The Hollywood Reporter, which was primarily focusing on the founding of an army, Clarence Tsui uses the term neo-propaganda to describe Operation Mekong. Also in a Hollywood Reporter article of May this year, highlighting the role of Hong Kong directors in making this new wave of action films, the veteran Hong Kong producer Zhong Chong also refers to them as main melody and tries to explain why Hong Kong directors are making main melody films. He uses this term several times. However, this categorization is problematic. Most main melody films are historical pieces, and these films, as I've been showing, are set in the present. Aside from the historical contemporary distinction, there's also further differences to note between these main melody films, which are rather stoic, and the current action films, which are more kinetic and individualistic. Rather than praise the role of the individual or the working masses in forming a modern Chinese state, the main melody films focus on the roles of great leaders. However, China's new action films focus on middle-ranking men of action, simultaneously grappling with unresolved personal issues, while leaders are generally just glimpsed as they deal with bureaucratic procedure. Admittedly, the main melody film has undergone modernization in recent years. They're not quite as bad, frankly, as they were. And this is mainly with regards to increased production value, the addition of A-list stars, and nationwide marketing campaigns. They used to go out on more regional rollouts. Crucially, though, most main melodies are produced by China Film, the state's China Film Company, their state productions, and they're also paid for in part by August Film Studio, which is the filmmaking branch of the military. By contrast, the new action films I'm talking about enter the market as commercial investments. They're not state films. They aim to capitalize on a current trend or gap in the market, and they're not part of a long-term ideological strategy. Main melody films are allocated more showtimes than necessary in the largest screens. They get a box office boost from state-affiliated companies that are required to block purchase tickets, and they're also protected from criticism. Douban, China's IMDb, disabled comments on the founding of an army, so people couldn't write negative things about it there. However, the new China action film just has to get out there and fight for itself. Furthermore, patriotism doesn't necessarily denote propaganda. It's a characteristic of most, if not all, national action cinemas. In his book Action Movies, Harvey O'Brien succinctly summarizes the genre as a cinema of striking back, of restoration and reassurance. And in this regard, China's new action films are patriotic in their take on how police forces and military will deal with threats. Still, China's so-called rising nationalism has been widely cited as one of the major factors in the box office success of Wolf Warrior 2, with its release coinciding with the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, implying propaganda components and the widespread adoption of the film as a nationalistic text. Yet, feelings of nationalism or lack of truly vary from citizen to citizen, young to old, urban to rural, and the spaces in between. In his recent article, Is Chinese Nationalism Rising, for the journal International Security, Alistair Ian Johnson challenges this widely held assumption through various studies conducted in Beijing, and he found levels of nationalism in a state of flux. Summarizing his samples, he states, "In 4 tests for rising nationalism, I find evidence that in some cases, levels of nationalism in Beijing today are lower than they were in the early 2000s. In other cases, the levels of nationalism may be somewhat higher than they were in the early 2000s, but are lower than they were in the mid to late 2000s. Johnson concedes that his sample only refers to Beijing, and that levels of nationalism may vary throughout the country, while also speculating that levels of nationalism peak or rise in spurts following certain occasions, special celebrations, of which the 2015 China Victory Day parade is a good example, with its demonstration of China's latest military hardware, which was showcased in high-definition glory in national television coverage. Shortly after the victory parade, when I agreed to, perhaps I shouldn't have done, I agreed to fill in for a friend who had a scheduling clash, and I went to judge a high school speaking competition out in Henan province. And most of the young participants responded to the potentially individualistic topic of I have a dream by instead talking about the recent military parade, professing pride based on how China was realizing its collective dream and had military capabilities that were equivalent to other nations. However, Johnson warns against putting too much academic stock in anecdotal evidence like this, as reports of fiercely nationalistic demonstrations by young citizens, the online attacks of the so-called Little Pink, who go to great measures to defend China in cyberspace, or interviews with university students who wish to adopt a more individualistic ideology, ultimately don't really say much about such a vast and diverse and dispersed country. As such, it's difficult to ascertain to what extent feelings of nationalism translate into box office receipts. But patriotism, if not exactly nationalism, certainly goes some way to explaining the popularity of the new China action film. Perhaps Wu Jing is just riding a patriotic wave with Wolf Warrior 2. In this respect, it has something in common with China's previous box office champ, Stephen Zhao's fantasy The Mermaid, which thrived in part based on widespread concern about China's environmental policies and for a period became an emblematic popular text. Beijing-based film critic Raymond Zhao has attributed the success of Wolf Warrior 2 just to a thirst for entertainment. He told The Guardian that Chinese people are exhausted after a day's work. They have a lot of pressure in life. So when they go to the cinema, they say, we don't want a history lesson. We don't want an experience that is similar to sitting in a classroom. We don't want to be educated. We just want to be entertained. At this stage of economic development, it's quite understandable. Huang Haikun, editor of Movie View magazine, has a similar take on the film's success, insisting that the impressive thing about the film is the fight scenes and the stunts. Wu certainly pushes for Hollywood quality action scenes, complete with sweeping aerial and crane shots, set pieces featuring deadly drones, sea-going vessels, marauding tanks. Each one is more spectacular and frankly unbelievable than the last, sometimes bordering on a tongue-in-cheek knowingness in its use of action film tropes. Lung Feng enters a hospital at one point by crashing a Humvee through a wall, because why walk through a door when you have a $30 million budget that enables you to crash through a wall? Later, he challenges the mayhem of the Fast and Furious series by doing some CGI-assisted drifting in a tank. You really have to see it to believe it. However, Wu Zheng is obviously aware that national pride is a valuable, perhaps untapped resource, and his statement that maybe people have kept their patriotism buried for too long, that passion has become somewhat like dry wood. But my movie is like the spark to light it again. This statement has often been quoted in coverage of the film. Reviewing the film for mixed media, Gabriel Chong suggests one can imagine that a large number of Wolf Warrior fans are in fact such fervent nationalists in the first place, and it's only logical that Wu Zheng decides to play to the gallery. Whether or not Wu Zheng has a nationalistic agenda or is just taking advantage of a moment when patriotic feeling is at peak, this is still a film that's rather bullish about China as an international force, as seen how through Wu depicts its relationship with Africa and its approach to a crisis situation that the United Nations will not act on. Wolf Warrior 2 takes place against the backdrop of China's huge investment push into Africa, its latest One Belt, One Road milestone, a network of roads, railways, and ports that will pass through dozens of countries in Africa and Asia. China insists that these One Belt, One Road developments will free the less developed small countries from economic stagnation. It's also made clear that China does not just bring money, but also military when working with Africa. And it challenges the legitimacy of other countries when working with Africa, such as India or Japan, with China claiming to be Africa's principal investor and noble protector. When Rachel suggests contacting the American embassy for assistance, Lung Feng dismisses her idea. He says, "When I was looking out to sea from the dock, I saw the Stars and Stripes flags among the country's masts heading into the distance." As much as the film seeks to affirm China's friendship with Africa, it often positions itself more as a protector or superior nation, as indicated by some of the film's marketing materials, which very much present Lung Feng as a savior character. And in this respect, Wolf Warrior 2 resorts to what could be termed a savior narrative that takes place using many of the tropes of Hollywood's long history of white savior films, and it robs Africa of much of its agency. The limited praise offered for the people of Africa comes from the factory guard who says, "Our African friends, it doesn't matter if it's a war, disease, or poverty. Once they're around a bonfire, all their cares go away." He then follows up with his view of the continent. Africa, great food, nice scenery, hot women. These two remarks largely sum up the film's vision of its local characters and environment, at least when they're not being riddled with bullets. Aside from Leng Feng's godson, none of the African characters are given significant personalities or arcs. Many serve as cannon fodder in scenes of brutality that challenge Black Hawk Down for ferocity, and occasionally give the film the unfortunate feel of an exploitation movie. Jonathan Landreth took issue with this in his rather mixed review for China Film Insider. He said, "There's the pudgy African kid who's either crying like a baby or stuffing his face. There's his Rubenesque mother whose body weight becomes a repeated sight gag when she smothers the bad guys with her flesh. There's the docile and suddenly feral little African girl, not to mention the bloodthirsty but expendable African rebels." He really didn't like it very much. However, there are moments of balance that do not always show China in the best possible light and make this film more interesting. They raise criticism regarding its opportunism in relation to Africa, albeit criticism directed at businessmen rather than policymakers. When Lung Feng arrives at the factory, he says, "I'm here to save you." As far as he's concerned, the you means everyone, the Africans and the Chinese. But there's other Chinese characters like the shopkeeper who rips off other Chinese visitors, the factory owner who breaks up characters who are in mixed marriages. There's also his son who likes the sound of gunfire and wants to be a glorious war hero and doesn't care if other people die in the process. The factory owner is money-minded. He makes decisions without the human factor. When it becomes apparent that Lung Feng is infected with a virus, he makes him leave. The second time Lung Feng has been cast out in the film after leaving the military. And when workers are getting ready to board a helicopter, the manager prioritizes the Chinese employees over the Africans. He orders the Africans to stay behind, saying, "Chinese over here, Africans over there." And he splits up the crowd, some of whom are actually in mixed marriages. In such situations, the film has a serious consideration of what it means to be Chinese. Even though the film trades in a certain nationalistic rhetoric, Tundu gets on the Navy ship because Lun Feng tells the guard he's his godson. Later, one Chinese worker insists on bringing his African spouse with him when being evacuated from the factory, insisting, "We're married now." That makes her Chinese, doesn't it? In this respect, the new China action film becomes a site of negotiation and consideration about what it means to be Chinese and how this evolves as more of China's professional class, not just its military, becomes involved outside of the mainland. In conclusion, China's new action cinema makes a break from previous strategies for challenging Hollywood's grip on the mainland audience. These films deliver exciting spectacle with top-notch production values and take place in today's world. They don't necessarily promote full-blown individualism, but they certainly move towards a new type of screen hero who demonstrates an individualistic streak. And the action films are now showing a sign of being a space for considering the role of an individual in this transformative society that's defined not so much now by traditional behavior as by accelerated developments and situations that must be adopted to. Today, China's action cinema is finally catching up with The Fugitive, and boys like this one, I'm sure by this point would now be saying, "Dad, I want to see Wolf Warrior 2 rather than the new Harrison Ford movie." Thank you very much.